The war in Ukraine appears to be slowly destabilizing North Korea from the inside out. It's making North Korea look temporarily stronger on the surface, with fat coffers freshly laden with large profits from weapons sales. But down below, this temptation to pursue quick, easy money in a small, isolated economy is exaggerating already severe economic problems and positioning the North Korean nation for what could be one of its largest food crises ever. North Korea has always struggled to produce enough food throughout almost its entire history since being split from South Korea. And now, tempted by the prospect of a limited time chance to get richer than they've ever been, they're redeploying as much domestic industry as possible to the production of weapons for Russia. But as is usually the case with dictatorships, this is an extremely short-sighted strategy and a huge gamble on North Korea's part, where the outcome is more likely than not to be devastating to the ruling regime over the coming generations. This might seem like an odd stance for this video to take. Ever since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, many people have been concerned about how Russia's actions are increasing North Korea's geopolitical power due to the ongoing weapons deals between the two nations. But most such assessments are based on an extremely short-term view of world history and geopolitics. And our question to analyze today is, do these concerns actually align with the full reality, once all factors have been taken into account? The research for today's video was made possible by our sponsor, Aura. If you research North Korea, one of the themes you'll come across is how their government weaponizes data to control their people. But government entities, unfortunately, aren't the only ones capable of doing that. Many people see our data as valuable, particularly scammers and spammers, the last people we would want knowing all our personal details. They're often able to buy our information from data brokers, who sell our information, without our knowledge, to the highest bidder. Like a real-life 1984 experience, your full name, email, home address, health records, your relatives, for most of us, it's all out there, just waiting to be purchased. Aura, the sponsor of today's video, helps put a stop to that. They can help identify which brokers are selling your information and automatically submit opt-out requests on your behalf. Cleaning up this information not only helps reduce the amount of spam you get, but it protects you from bad actors who could use this information to help them access things like your social media accounts, bank accounts, or other sensitive information. But Aura also does so much more to keep you protected from online threats. Their all-in-one product includes features like antivirus, VPN, password management, parental controls, identity theft insurance, and more, without having to download several different apps. It's easy to set up, and best of all, you can get everything at one affordable price. I value my privacy, and I value yours. To start your 2-week free trial, you can go to aura.com/Icarus, which is also linked below this video in the description. Now, back to North Korea. When evaluating the present situation of North Korea and Russia, there are a few guiding principles from history that we need to understand, zooming out from today's headlines to capture a broader, more accurate historical picture. No nation has ever put itself in a place of lasting power by hollowing out its own infrastructure and making itself more dependent on others for basic necessities. And while authoritarian governments are certainly willing to allow their own people to suffer harm if it means more prosperity for the elites, even that has its limits. Historically, dictatorships have fallen, not usually because of excessive pressure from the outside, since usually most other nations aren't concerned enough to physically intervene against an isolated dictatorship, though a few dramatic examples from recent world history might tend to make us think otherwise. Instead, dictatorships more often than not end up consuming themselves by becoming too confident and pushing their own people too far, past the breaking point they are willing to tolerate. And no dictatorship has ever lasted indefinitely. Usually, the collapse of a regime takes several generations, but at some point, as dictators take more and more power and prosperity, and leave less and less for everyone else, the risk to the people within the nation for performing a coup against the dictatorial regime becomes smaller than the risks of not doing so, and the collapse comes from within. So when evaluating the strength of a dictatorship, like North Korea, one must not look at its comparative strength to other nations on the outside, where a conflict is exceedingly unlikely to ever take place. Instead, they should look to the internal strength and sustainability of the dictatorship itself. This is especially true among smaller dictatorships, where their available military force is not sufficient to actually defeat other nations in battle. In these nations, like modern-day North Korea, military force is always used more to control their own people and portray an aura of strength internally, to keep people obedient to them, than it is to actually engage in warfare against other nations. Dictators of small nations know that such warfare would always be a losing prospect, and therefore it is unlikely to ever happen, since the primary goal of a small dictatorship is to sustain and grow its power and wealth at home, not to throw away a life of comfort for an unlikely gamble. Understanding these realities is very helpful in developing a sober analysis of North Korea's current situation. Upon first glance at North Korea right now, things might look really bad for the Western world, and you wouldn't be hard-pressed to find newspaper headlines portraying things that way. On the surface, North Korea appears stronger than ever in the eyes of many due to newfound cash from weapons sales and military security arrangements with Russia that signal an openness to the Kremlin placing nuclear missiles on North Korean territory. But the question is, do these developments actually change anything substantial? And if they do, how sticky actually is North Korea's newfound power? First, the basic facts. In recent years, North Korea has been seen transferring massive quantities of weapons to Russia, particularly artillery shells and ballistic missiles. And since the start of the war in Ukraine, more than 13,000 shipping containers full of munitions have been seen traveling between North Korea and Russia, containers which could have contained up to a total of over 6 million artillery shells, according to South Korean authorities. That's enough shells, on its own, to sustain around 1.5 to 2 years of Russia's artillery barrages against Ukraine. And this has allowed Russia to continue its military campaign with supplies that their own domestic production capacities have proven unable to sufficiently replace. A key fact, as it turns out, which we'll revisit in just a moment. From the Russian perspective, North Korean supplies are preventing Russia from getting too close to total collapse too quickly, giving them a chance to stay in the fight long enough for Western nations to hopefully eventually lose interest and allow Russia to win the war. And this puts North Korea in a rather interesting position, where North Korea is the real version of what Russia is constantly accusing the West of being, the warmonger supplying weapons to the war in Ukraine, who secretly hopes the war never ends and that other adjacent wars will begin, so that they can profit off of the continuing chaos. And as the word profit implies, obviously, North Korea isn't doing this for free, even less so out of the goodness of their hearts. North Korea wants something in return for all of their weapons, and that something is money, military protection agreements, and in some cases, trade, often in the form of shipments of food. Understandably, people are concerned that this money and these military protection agreements are contributing to a world that will be much less safe in the long term, particularly around the Korean Peninsula. This is especially true because of the implied nuclear nature of such agreements. And no one could blame a person for being concerned about this, especially in the short term. But in the mid to long term, we should probably look deeper than the mere surface here, especially understanding the fragility of agreements between nations run by dictators, who have already proven they are willing to stab their best friends in the back as soon as they are no longer beneficial to them. And the fact that North Korea requires food specifically as part of their weapons deals with Russia is rather telling. Let's back up one step to connect some dots that most people seem to be missing. Recall that fact I told you to remember? Russia is relying on North Korea for weapons delivery precisely because their own domestic capacity is not sufficient for their needs. And yet, North Korea is a nation that is much smaller and much more limited than Russia is, by every measure. And since both nations have a similar dictatorial form of government, North Korea doesn't have any special production advantages when it comes to producing military equipment that Russia itself could not also obtain. So the question is, if Russia cannot handle its own weapons production internally, how is North Korea, a much smaller and more limited nation, able to do so without major internal consequences? And the answer is, obviously, that they can't, because magic doesn't exist. So what are those internal consequences that North Korea is facing? Well, artillery shells don't appear out of thin air. They require resources and people to create them. And for every effort invested in creating military gear, you are setting something else aside that you could be creating instead. And all signs point to the fact that, in order to optimize their economy completely for the production of military gear for Russia to capture short-term profits, North Korea has sacrificed food production, which could be catastrophic for the nation in the long term, and much more devastating to North Korea than a loss in a military campaign that isn't likely to ever happen. As we said earlier in this video, North Korea has always struggled to produce enough food throughout almost its entire history since being split from South Korea. To put a number behind that, the US Department of Agriculture's International Food Security Assessment, published in September 2022, estimated that close to 70% of North Korea's population was food insecure, a fairly normal stat for North Korea. This assessment was published during the same year that North Korea decided to refocus a large portion of their nation's agricultural industry towards weapons production instead. In other words, North Korea has always been just one poor harvest away from major destabilization, which, if severe enough, could cause the loss of such a huge percentage of their population that the current regime would no longer be viable. Such scenarios should not be taken lightly, considering that such wide-scale famines have really happened within the past generation, such as to the Soviet Union and to the Russian Empire before them, for similar underlying reasons. While the Soviet Union was trumpeting the production of basic goods such as steel, iron, and coal as measures of success to project strength to the outside world, they apparently forgot about the basic importance of things like food security and internal cohesion. And North Korea is no different, and no less short-sighted. For years, North Korea has played these odds, and gotten lucky. But all it takes is for them to get unlucky once for the regime to potentially come crashing down. And by moving to a full-scale military economy to back Russia's war, they are making their chances of long-term survival worse than ever in recent history. Obviously, North Korea has to somehow justify to its people why their entire country is moving away from food production and towards producing weapons for a third party. To do that, Kim Jong-un has focused on heightening and exaggerating tensions between North Korea and the US and South Korea. But as always, this isn't so much because there is actually an imminent threat of war between these nations. It's more just that North Korea has to justify its illogical actions to its people somehow, to help control internal dissatisfaction and potential rebellion, the true guiding principles behind most of what the North Korean regime says and does. It also helps that in the short term, in exchange for weapons, North Korea can trade Russia for food, hiding the risks of this shift in industry from their people. But such an arrangement is inherently insecure. After all, if Russia thought exchanging food production for weapons production was a good gamble, they would have done it themselves. As North Korea trades their farms for weapons factories in exchange for food shipments from Russia, it makes North Korea literally dependent on a constant state of Russian war to maintain their standard of living, substandard as it might already be. And likewise, this arrangement also makes the Kremlin dependent on North Korean weapon supplies to hide the true cost of the war from the Russian people, by forcing the North Korean people to endure living through a full wartime economy and its associated risks, rather than those people living in Moscow or St. Petersburg. But if either side of the perilous equation breaks down, both regimes could fall together in rapid succession. Assuming North Korea could trust Russia for indefinite future food supplies, perhaps their destabilizing food crises will never actually come to fruition. But if that's your national plan for survival, assuming that you can trust Russia, I, unfortunately, have some pretty terrible news for you. If Russia ever finds themselves no longer in need of North Korean help, and stops their food shipments, a highly likely future scenario, and North Korea finds themselves behind on the harvest because they focused on building artillery shells rather than planting seeds, another highly likely scenario, it could spiral downhill very fast. What makes this especially perilous for North Korea is that a starvation crisis caused by food shortages cannot be reversed quickly. Food can't be produced in an instant. You have to wait for it to grow. And once people are gone, they're gone, and they can't reproduce or contribute to a nation's economy or defense, causing the nation to fall behind for several generations, and making it impossible for the regime to recover within the dictator's lifetime. That's worthy of an entire analysis in and of itself, like my recent video on Russia's demographic crisis. And if this all sounds like dramatic what-ifs, think again. To understand how real the risk is, it helps to look at the current state of weapons production in the West, and contrast it with what we see in North Korea and Russia. When it comes to Western weapons suppliers right now, Russian propaganda is constantly accusing them of provoking further war with Ukraine for their own personal profit, making it seem like the prolonged war is the West's fault and not Russia's. But the situation we actually see on the ground, generally speaking, is quite different. What we actually see are large weapons contracts being made available, but with regular suppliers hesitant to take them on or fulfill them quickly. Western weapons suppliers are currently willing to fill contracts up to the limits of existing infrastructure, but most of them are very hesitant to make further capital investment in building more factories or production capacity to scale things up, fearing that they will not see a return on those investments. On one hand, that's part of what has made weapons supplies to Ukraine so slow and so small, particularly when it comes to things like artillery shells, which is not so great. But perhaps the positive side to this that we rarely hear being talked about is that one of the reasons supplies have been so slow for Ukraine is because Western weapon suppliers aren't confident enough that war will continue over the long term to be willing to invest more capital in building weapons of warfare at a faster scale. It could be argued that this is due to mere ignorance or wishful thinking, and those would be worthwhile arguments. But the point is, Western weapon suppliers are still pursuing a cautious approach that recognizes the very real risks of overinvesting in weapons production at the expense of other opportunities. They understand the problems that getting things wrong and overinvesting in just one industry could cause. And now you might see what I'm driving at. While the West is hesitant to overinvest, North Korea is the opposite, moving away from the production of the essentials they need today in favor of building weapons for what they hope is a lasting conflict. Kim Jong-un is gambling on a future of warfare, and only on that future, hindering his options if the dictator's worst nightmare comes to fruition, and peace in Ukraine is actually achieved. And the question is, if the United States, the largest economy in the world, sees the cost of building further military infrastructure to supply the specific weapons needed for the war in Ukraine as more risky than it's worth, how could North Korea, one of the world's smaller economies, possibly afford to take on such risks? Obviously, they can't. This creates some dire prospects for the ordinary North Korean person, but for North Korea as a state, it is unfortunately a known reality, and a risk considered worth taking for further riches. In the famous words of Lord Farquaad from Shrek, applied in this case to Kim Jong-un, some of you may die, but that's a sacrifice I'm willing to make.
Some of you may die, but it's a sacrifice I am willing to make.
On full analysis, the current reality for North Korea is that they have gained no substantial long-term advantages by selling weapons to Russia, but they have made large gambles that could potentially lead to severe problems for them, including even destabilization. Certainly, North Korea has received some things of value from Russia, like military protection agreements and potential access to Russia's nuclear missiles. And, on the surface, those things raise fears that North Korea is potentially on the warpath. But on closer analysis, that's not the strongest conclusion. After all, North Korea already had nukes, so receiving more from Russia doesn't make them substantially more threatening, unless Russia were to give them their entire nuclear arsenal, which isn't going to happen. And if North Korea were preparing to go to war with the broader world, or even just with South Korea, why would they be sending all of their best artillery shells, ballistic missiles, and other equipment to Russia? Short answer, they wouldn't be. North Korea already was, and always will be, in a position where they are not militarily strong enough to stand up to the United States, let alone the combined West. They project military strength not to be able to actually fight these opponents, but rather to keep those on the inside of North Korea under control. So worrying about North Korea gaining a few extra missiles or a little bit of extra cash seems to be short-sighted. On the other hand, if North Korea is trading internal strength or stability to gain these things, that is more harmful to them than many people realize. By being short-sighted and trading long-term regime security for short-term weapons profits, they are actually making it more likely for their regime to fall, even as they project outward strength. And that is far more damaging to North Korea than Russian nukes are helping it. Always remember, when the center is hollow, it doesn't matter what material the surface is made out of. It might look intimidating and impenetrable from the outside, but just a little pressure, and it will collapse in on itself. While many people fear nuclear warfare because of current events, I've begun to take a different stance. It seems that we are seeing the crumbling of nuclear powers from the inside out, and they are being defeated in the only safe way they can be defeated without launching their doomsday weapons in retaliation. Soon, we could be watching the collapse of our modern dictators, in the same way the generations before us watched the collapse of their dictators in catastrophic and successive fashion. This video isn't the only argument supporting that. We have a lot more. So for more, be sure to check out these videos on screen next. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We'll see you on the next one.